We have a warrant for your arrest." At 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 men in dark uniforms stormed onto my ranch with gleaming badges and voices like thunder. Prairie Ridge enforcement officers. "Mr. Jack Harlan is accused of violating community regulations." I stood frozen. "HOA on my land, 5 miles outside their jurisdiction. You must stop all unauthorized construction activities immediately." The badges looked laser-printed. Vehicles had no official unit numbers, but their tone was too convincing to doubt. In the distance, a silver sedan sat silently, and someone was watching our every move. The lead officer stepped forward, uniform crisp, but wrong in subtle ways. My military-trained, I couldn't quite name it. "Mr. Harlan, we've received multiple complaints about violations of community standards on your property," he said, flashing what appeared to be an official badge. They carried themselves with that manufactured authority that makes most civilians instantly obey. But my gut screamed that none of this was real. I'd bought this ranch precisely because it lay beyond any HOA boundary, paying good money to escape their petty regulations. Yet here they were, standing on my land like they owned it. The morning mist coiled around us, and for a fleeting second, I questioned everything I thought I knew about property rights, just because their confidence felt so official. "I'm sorry, but there's been some mistake," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "This property isn't part of any HOA, and you have no jurisdiction here." The lead officer pulled out a folder and began flipping through official-looking documents with practiced efficiency. "According to County Ordinance 147B, he said, reading from a paper with an official seal, "HOAs now have expanded enforcement authority over surrounding properties that might affect community standards throughout the region." My stomach dropped because I'd been getting confusing county mail lately about zoning updates, and maybe I'd missed something important. The doubt crept in like poison. What if my understanding of property rights was simply outdated? What if I was the one who was wrong here? The document he handed me looked legitimate enough, complete with seals and legal language designed to overwhelm rather than clarify. The psychological impact of their coordinated presentation was exactly what they had intended, to create enough confusion and self-doubt that I would comply rather than risk challenging what appeared to be legitimate government authority. Every aspect of their approach had been carefully designed to exploit the natural tendency of law-abiding citizens to defer to official-looking authority, even when that authority felt wrong on a gut level. The timing of their visit at dawn, when most people aren't thinking clearly, the overwhelming presence of multiple uniformed officers, and the professional-looking documentation, all worked together to create a scenario where resistance seemed both futile and potentially dangerous to my legal standing as a property owner. As I examined the paperwork with growing bewilderment, my peripheral vision caught something that made my skin crawl. About 200 yards down the road, that silver sedan with the HOA Prairie Ridge bumper sticker sat motionless on the shoulder. Through the morning haze, I could make out a figure in the driver's seat holding what looked like binoculars, documenting our entire interaction with methodical precision. The sight triggered memories from my military days when being watched usually meant someone was planning something unpleasant. My hands started to shake slightly as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just some bureaucratic misunderstanding. This was coordinated, planned, and designed to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. The level of preparation they had put into this encounter suggested something far more sinister than simple regulatory enforcement. "Mr. Harlan," the lead officer said, his voice taking on an edge designed to make me understand that resistance would be costly. "Failure to comply with our investigation could result in significant citations and liens being placed against your property." The threat landed like a physical blow, but something about the delivery felt rehearsed rather than natural. When one of them called in to report our interaction, he gave the wrong area code for our county, a detail I caught because I dealt with county offices during my property purchase. The mistake was small but telling, like watching an actor forget his lines just for a moment. My military training kicked in, and I started cataloging inconsistencies. Vehicles with emergency lights, but no unit numbers, uniforms with generic patches, and an overall approach that felt more like private security playing dress-up than legitimate law enforcement. The performance was good, but it wasn't perfect, and those cracks were starting to show. The whole interaction lasted about 20 minutes, during which they photographed my construction work from multiple angles and made detailed notes about my property layout. They measured distances, documented building materials, and asked pointed questions about my construction timeline that felt more like intelligence gathering than routine compliance checking. The level of detail they were collecting seemed far beyond what would be necessary for simple violations, assuming those violations were even legitimate. Every question felt calculated to extract maximum information about my daily routines, security measures, and vulnerable points around the property. "We'll be filing our report with the appropriate authorities," the lead officer informed me as they prepared to leave, handing me a business card. "You should expect to hear from us again soon. We strongly advise against continuing any construction activities until this matter is resolved." The warning felt more like a threat than advice, delivered with the kind of barely concealed menace that's designed to make you think twice about resistance. As their black SUVs disappeared down the road, I noticed that the silver sedan with the Observer had also vanished, leaving behind only tire tracks and a lingering sense that I had just been the target of an elaborate performance. Standing alone in my driveway, I held the stack of paperwork they had left behind, documents that supposedly granted an HOA authority over property outside their jurisdiction. But as I examined them more closely in the growing daylight, Small inconsistencies began to emerge. Fonts that didn't match legitimate county documents, paper quality that felt wrong, and most importantly, an address for HOA Prairie Ridge that didn't include a zip code, something that would never happen on genuine official correspondence. My hands were steady again as I walked back to the house and fired up my computer to research County Ordinance 147B. After searching through every county website and legal database I could find, the truth became crystal clear. The ordinance didn't exist. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Someone had created fake legal documents, deployed uniformed personnel to my ranch, and conducted an elaborate con game designed to make me believe I was subject to regulations that simply didn't exist. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking, but it also raised deeply troubling questions about who would go to such lengths and why. If they were bold enough to forge county ordinances and impersonate law enforcement officers, what other fake authority might they be willing to use? More importantly, why had they targeted my specific property when there were dozens of other rural landowners who would have been equally vulnerable? As I sat staring at the fake documents spread across my kitchen table, one thought kept circling through my mind like a warning bell. If this was their opening move, what exactly were they planning to do for an encore? The next morning, I called HOA Prairie Ridge directly, hoping to get some answers about what had happened on my property. The receptionist, Susan, answered with practiced cheerfulness that immediately shifted when I mentioned my name. "Oh yes, Mr. Harlan," she said, her tone becoming notably cooler and taking on that particular bureaucratic edge that government workers use when they want you to know you're being difficult. "I see you're on our regional compliance watch list. While your property isn't technically within our boundaries, new state regulations allow HOAs to monitor surrounding areas that might affect our community standards." The words hit me like ice water because they sounded plausible enough to create that same nagging doubt I'd felt the day before. Maybe there really had been changes to state law that I'd somehow missed. Maybe I was fighting against something that was perfectly legitimate, even if it felt wrong. "I wasn't aware of any new state regulations," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Could you send me the specific statute numbers so I can review them myself?" There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long before Susan responded, her voice taking on that passive-aggressive tone that bureaucrats perfect over years of dealing with difficult citizens. "I'll have to check with our legal department about that," she said with barely concealed irritation. "But in the meantime, I should inform you that we've received additional complaints about your property since yesterday's inspection. The violations are becoming quite serious." The timing felt suspicious. Additional complaints filed within hours of the fake enforcement visit. It was like they were building a paper trail to justify whatever they were planning next. I asked for specifics about these new complaints, but Susan became evasive, saying she could only discuss details with property owners who were part of their compliance program. Within 2 hours of that phone call, my day became a masterclass in psychological warfare. First came a notice of violation in my mailbox, citing unsightly livestock pens and unauthorized construction activities. The document looked official enough to fool most people, complete with reference numbers and legal language about community standards. Then my phone rang. Victoria Langford herself, the HOA president, calling personally to discuss my situation. "Jack," she said, using my first name with the kind of warm familiarity that politicians deploy when they want something from you. "I understand there's been some confusion about our enforcement authority. We're really trying to help you avoid serious county fines that could affect your property value. The best thing for everyone would be if we could work together on this." Her voice carried that polished charm of someone who had spent years convincing people that her agenda was actually in their best interest. "I appreciate your concern," I replied, "but I'm still not clear on how an HOA has jurisdiction over property that's not part of your community." Victoria's response was smooth and practiced, delivered with the kind of confident expertise that makes you feel foolish for questioning obvious truths. "The new Regional Compliance Initiative allows us to address issues that affect the broader community's property values. It's actually quite innovative. We're one of the first associations in the state to implement this kind of proactive approach." She made it sound like they were visionary leaders rather than whatever they actually were, which I was beginning to suspect was something far more sinister. The conversation ended with her promising to send me educational materials about the new regulations, but something about her tone suggested that education wasn't really what she had in mind. The psychological pressure didn't stop there. Around noon, a man claiming to be a county building inspector showed up at my door with another citation. This one was for continuing construction work without proper permits, despite the fact that all my permits were current and properly displayed. When I pointed this out, he became aggressive, insisting that new regulations required additional oversight for properties in sensitive compliance zones. The term meant nothing that I could find in any legitimate county documentation, but he delivered it with the kind of bureaucratic certainty that makes you question your own sanity. He took photos of my permit display and made notes about my uncooperative attitude, then warned me that continued violations could result in work stoppage orders that would be enforced by the sheriff's department. That evening, I started researching everything I could find about HOA Prairie Ridge and their supposed enforcement authority. What I discovered was deeply troubling. There were scattered reports online from other property owners in the region who'd experienced similar harassment. One post from 4 months earlier asked, "Anyone else been harassed by HOA Prairie Ridge enforcement outside their jurisdiction?" They claimed regional authority, but I think it's complete nonsense. The post had no replies, which suggested either that other victims were too intimidated to respond or that the problem was more widespread than anyone realized. Another post mentioned fake inspectors showing up at rural properties with official-looking credentials that didn't check out under scrutiny. As I dug deeper into public records, I found something that made my blood run cold. HOA Prairie Ridge had recently purchased compliance consulting services from a company called Regional Authority Solutions, a business that apparently hadn't existed 6 months ago. The shell company had no real address, no employee roster, and no legitimate business history that I could find. Yet, somehow they were providing enforcement consulting to multiple HOAs throughout the county. The pattern was becoming clear. This wasn't just harassment of individual property owners. This was systematic, organized, and designed to create the appearance of legitimate authority where none actually existed. Someone was running a sophisticated operation that targeted rural landowners with fake regulations and manufactured compliance requirements. The silver sedan made its second appearance that evening, parked about a quarter-mile from my house with its occupant watching my property through binoculars. This time, I was ready for it, and I used my own binoculars to get a better look at the observer. It was a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, and she was definitely documenting my activities with the methodical precision of someone conducting surveillance. When I started walking toward the road to get a closer look, she immediately drove away. I took a few quick steps forward, watching the dust trail her tires kicked up as she accelerated down the gravel road, but she was already too far away for me to get any useful details about the vehicle or driver. The fact that they were maintaining active surveillance on my property meant this was far more serious than simple HOA overreach. Someone was investing significant time and resources into monitoring my daily routine. And that level of attention suggested they were planning something that required detailed intelligence about my habits and vulnerabilities. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me wonder if they were escalating their campaign of intimidation. The fake enforcement visit, the psychological pressure through phone calls and fake inspectors, and now active surveillance. It all pointed to a coordinated effort that went far beyond normal HOA authority, legitimate or otherwise. Someone had decided that my property was worth enough effort to justify creating an entire fake regulatory framework, complete with manufactured legal authority and professional-looking documentation. But why my ranch specifically? What made my land so important that they were willing to risk charges of impersonating government officials and document fraud? As I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and rustle outside, I realized that whoever was behind this had made one critical mistake. They had chosen to target someone with military training who knew how to recognize and respond to systematic intimidation tactics. The next morning brought the answer to my biggest question, but not in a way I'd expected. While researching state regulations about HOA authority, I discovered that no such expansion of jurisdiction had ever been passed by the state legislature. There were no new laws, no regional compliance initiatives, and no legal basis for anything that HOA Prairie Ridge claimed to be doing. Every regulation they'd cited was completely fabricated. Every authority they claimed was entirely fictional, and every official-looking document they presented was a well-crafted forgery. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it confirmed that I wasn't crazy or ignorant of my rights, but terrifying because it meant someone was running a criminal operation sophisticated enough to fool government officials and create believable fake legal authority. If they were willing to go this far to target rural property owners, what else were they capable of? And more importantly, who was masterminding this entire operation from behind the scenes? The revelation that every piece of supposed legal authority was fabricated hit me like a lightning bolt. But it also cleared my head in a way that nothing had since this nightmare began. I wasn't dealing with legitimate government overreach or confusing new regulations. I was dealing with criminals. And criminals, no matter how sophisticated their operation, always leave traces of their real intentions if you know where to look. My military training had taught me that the best way to counter an organized threat is to understand its structure, motivations, and weaknesses. So I shifted from defensive confusion to offensive intelligence gathering. And what I discovered in the next 48 hours changed everything I thought I knew about this situation. My first stop was the corporate filing records for HOA Prairie Ridge, which turned out to be a treasure trove of suspicious activity. The association had amended its bylaws 3 times in the past year, and each amendment had expanded their claimed enforcement authority in ways that seemed designed to justify exactly the kind of harassment I was experiencing. The language was carefully crafted to sound official while remaining vague enough to mean whatever they wanted it to mean. More interesting was the board composition. Victoria Langford had been president for less than 18 months, but in that time she'd managed to replace most of the original board members with people who had no apparent connection to the community beyond their loyalty to her agenda. Her professional background was particularly enlightening. Before becoming HOA president, she'd worked for a real estate development company that specialized in rural property acquisition and redevelopment. The deeper I dug into Victoria's history, the more the pieces started falling into place. She had previously worked for a political consulting firm that specialized in what they called grassroots pressure campaigns, essentially manufacturing public support for development projects that local communities might otherwise oppose. The company's client list included several major developers who'd been accused of using intimidation tactics to acquire rural properties below market value. Victoria knew exactly how to manipulate systems and people to achieve her goals, and she'd apparently decided to apply those skills to creating her own little empire of fake authority. The Regional Authority Solutions company that HOA Prairie Ridge had hired traced back to the same business address as Victoria's personal consulting firm, confirming what I'd already suspected. She was essentially paying herself to create the appearance of legitimate outside authority for her illegal activities. Armed with this information, I decided to take a more proactive approach to my situation. Instead of waiting for the next wave of harassment, I would attend the next HOA board meeting as a concerned neighbor and see what I could learn from observing their operations firsthand. The meeting was held in a community center about 7 miles from my ranch, and I arrived early to get a good seat and observe the board members before the formal proceedings began. Victoria commanded the room with the kind of polished authority that comes from years of manipulating public meetings to achieve predetermined outcomes. She had a way of making her agenda sound reasonable and inevitable, even when she was proposing things that should have raised serious legal questions among anyone paying attention. During the public comment period, I stood up and politely asked about the enforcement activities that had been taking place on properties outside the HOA boundaries. Victoria's response was masterful in its blend of bureaucratic authority and concerned community leadership. "Mr. Harlan," she said, using my name like she'd been expecting my question, "I understand your concerns about our regional compliance initiative. What you may not realize is that property maintenance issues in surrounding areas have a direct impact on our community's property values and quality of life. The new state regulations allow us to take proactive steps to address these issues before they become serious problems for everyone in the region." The way she delivered this explanation made it sound perfectly reasonable, even though I now knew that every word of it was a carefully constructed lie designed to intimidate people into compliance. What was most revealing, however, was the reaction of the other board members to my questions. Most of them looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact in ways that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with Victoria's expanding interpretation of their authority. One board member in particular, an older woman named Margaret, seemed genuinely surprised by some of Victoria's claims about state regulations and enforcement procedures. After the meeting, I approached Margaret privately and discovered that she'd been growing increasingly concerned about the direction Victoria was taking the association. "Jack," she said, glancing around nervously to make sure we weren't being overheard, "I have to tell you something. Victoria convinced the board that expanding control to surrounding properties would increase everyone's property values, but many of us are uncomfortable with how aggressive these enforcement actions have become. She's very persuasive, but some of the things she's proposing don't feel legal to me." Margaret's admission confirmed what I had suspected. Victoria was operating with minimal oversight from a board that didn't fully understand what she was doing or lacked the expertise to challenge her claims about legal authority. Over the next few days, I maintained contact with Margaret and learned that Victoria had been making major financial decisions without proper board approval, including the $50,000 payment to Regional Authority Solutions that had no recorded board authorization. Margaret also revealed that several board members had been asking questions about the legality of their enforcement activities, but Victoria had dismissed their concerns by claiming that her legal background made her the most qualified person to interpret the new regulations. The manipulation was subtle but effective. She was using her supposed expertise to silence opposition while gradually expanding her authority beyond anything the board had originally intended to approve. My research also revealed a disturbing pattern in Victoria's targeting strategy. The 6 rural properties that had been subjected to harassment weren't randomly selected. They were all valuable pieces of land with high development potential, owned by people who were likely to be isolated and vulnerable to intimidation tactics. Victoria had apparently identified properties that could be acquired below market value if their owners could be convinced that continued harassment and legal problems made selling their best option. The level of strategic thinking involved was impressive in its ruthlessness, and it suggested that Victoria had been planning this operation for months, or possibly years, before putting it into action. The surveillance aspect of their operation became clearer when I started paying closer attention to the silver sedan's appearances around my property. The timing wasn't random. The observer always showed up during specific activities like construction work, property maintenance, or when I had visitors. They were documenting my daily routines with the kind of systematic approach that suggested they were building a comprehensive intelligence file on my habits and vulnerabilities. More disturbing was the realization that they probably had similar files on all their other targets, which meant Victoria's operation was far more sophisticated and organized than a simple HOA power grab. This was a systematic campaign of intimidation designed to psychologically break down resistance until victims concluded that compliance was their only viable option. The breakthrough came when I decided to do some after-hours reconnaissance of my own. Late one evening, I drove by the HOA office building and noticed that Victoria's car was still in the parking lot despite the fact that the building should have been closed. The office lights were on, and through the windows I could see Victoria working at her computer with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was doing something important. On impulse, I decided to see if I could get a closer look at what she was working on. And I discovered that the building's security was surprisingly lax for an organization that was supposedly conducting legitimate business. The back entrance was secured only by a standard commercial lock that my military training had taught me how to bypass without leaving evidence of entry. What I found on Victoria's computer was a smoking gun that confirmed every suspicion I developed about her operation. Her email folders contained detailed instructions to her enforcement team about psychological pressure techniques, property assessment protocols, and something called acquisition timeline optimization. One particularly damning email thread discussed the importance of using official-sounding language but avoiding any claims of actual government authority to minimize legal liability. Victoria knew exactly what she was doing, and she'd been careful to structure her operation in ways that gave her maximum intimidation value, while theoretically staying just short of the most serious criminal charges. But the evidence on her computer proved that this was a deliberate criminal enterprise designed to defraud rural property owners through manufactured authority and systematic psychological manipulation. The most chilling discovery was a detailed map showing not just the properties they had already targeted, but a dozen additional rural landowners who were apparently next on their list. Each property was marked with acquisition priority rankings, resistance assessments, and timeline projections that treated human beings like obstacles to be removed rather than citizens with rights to be respected. Victoria wasn't just running a scam. She was building what could only be described as a criminal empire designed to systematically strip rural landowners of their property through fake authority and psychological warfare. The scope of her ambitions was breathtaking, but it also revealed the weakness in her operation. She'd become so confident in her methods that she was keeping detailed records of her criminal activities, creating exactly the kind of evidence that could be used to bring down her entire network. As I copied the most damning files to a flash drive, one thought kept running through my mind. If Victoria was careful enough to avoid explicitly impersonating government officials, then what were her enforcement officers actually doing? And more importantly, how many other rural property owners were already trapped in her web of fake authority, believing they had no choice but to surrender their rights to avoid even worse consequences? The evidence I'd gathered was enough to expose Victoria's operation, but I was beginning to realize that bringing her down would require more than just proof of fraud. It would require a coordinated effort to protect her victims and ensure that her network of fake authority could never be used to terrorize rural communities again. The evidence I'd gathered from Victoria's computer should have given me confidence, but instead it filled me with a cold dread that kept me awake for the next 2 nights. What I discovered wasn't just a local scam targeting a few rural property owners. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with political connections and long-term strategic goals that went far beyond simple property acquisition. Victoria wasn't just some power-hungry HOA president. She was an architect of systematic oppression who understood exactly how to exploit the gaps between legitimate authority and public perception. And if the timeline I'd found in her files was accurate, I was about to experience the full force of what she called Phase 2 escalation protocols. The waiting was almost worse than the harassment itself because I knew something was coming, but had no idea what form it would take. The escalation began with a document that looked so official and threatening that it momentarily shook my confidence despite everything I'd learned. An administrative lien notice appeared in my mailbox, claiming that I owed $15,000 in regional compliance fees and enforcement costs related to ongoing violations on my property. The document bore county seals that looked authentic, legal language that sounded plausible, and threatening references to property seizure procedures that could theoretically be initiated if I didn't respond within 10 business days. Even though I knew Victoria was capable of creating sophisticated forgeries, the professional quality of this particular document was impressive enough to make me question whether she might have some legitimate legal authority that I'd missed in my research. The psychological impact was exactly what she'd intended, to create enough doubt and fear that I would comply rather than risk losing everything I'd worked for. My immediate response was to call the lawyer I'd used for my property purchase, hoping he could help me understand whether this lien notice had any legitimate basis. After examining the document carefully, he confirmed my worst fears and my best hopes simultaneously. This format is incredibly sophisticated, he told me during our phone conversation. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to make this look real, using actual county seal templates and proper legal formatting. But the legal authority claimed in this document is questionable at best, and I can't find any record of these compliance fees in county regulations. HOAs simply don't have the power to place liens on properties outside their jurisdiction, regardless of what this document claims. His analysis gave me the confirmation I needed that Victoria was escalating to outright fraud, but it also highlighted how convincing her forgeries were becoming. If a practicing attorney needed time to verify that this was fake, how many other property owners would simply pay rather than risk legal challenges they couldn't afford? The psychological warfare didn't stop with the lien notice. Over the next few days, I found myself becoming increasingly suspicious of everyone around me, wondering who might be working for Victoria's network, and who was simply an innocent neighbor caught up in her web of deception. When Margaret, the board member who had expressed concerns about Victoria's activities, contacted me to request a private meeting, my first instinct was to wonder whether this was some kind of trap designed to gather intelligence about my response to their escalation tactics. The level of paranoia I was experiencing was exactly what Victoria wanted: isolated property owners who couldn't trust anyone and had no idea where to turn for legitimate help. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that was designed to make resistance seem hopeless and compliance appear to be the only rational choice. Margaret's meeting request, however, turned out to be genuine. And what she told me during our clandestine conversation in a coffee shop 20 miles from town changed my entire understanding of Victoria's operation. "Jack," she said, glancing nervously around the nearly empty restaurant to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Victoria has fired me from the board. She claims I was leaking confidential information about enforcement procedures, but the truth is that I was asking too many questions about the legality of what we were doing. She's planning something big, and she mentioned something called the final acquisition phase during our last executive session. Margaret's revelation confirmed that Victoria's operation was moving towards some kind of endgame that would presumably make her fake authority either legitimate or irrelevant. The timeline I'd seen in her computer files suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't just harassing property owners for the sake of harassment. She was working toward a specific goal that would fundamentally change the power structure in our rural community. The true scope of Victoria's ambitions became clear when my lawyer called back with news that was both validating and terrifying. That lien document is completely fraudulent, he confirmed. But whoever created it went to extraordinary lengths to make it appear legitimate. They used actual county seal templates, copied formatting from real legal documents, and even included reference numbers that matched the pattern used by legitimate county paperwork. This level of sophistication suggests that someone with significant resources and legal knowledge is behind this operation. His analysis confirmed what I'd suspected about Victoria's background, but it also highlighted the criminal liability she was accumulating through her increasingly bold forgeries. Creating fake government documents wasn't just harassment. It was a federal crime that could result in serious prison time if properly prosecuted. My investigation into Victoria's broader network revealed that her operation was even more extensive than I had initially realized. She had registered at least 3 shell companies in the past 6 months: Regional Authority Solutions, County Compliance Services, and Property Standards Enforcement LLC. All 3 companies shared the same registered agent, Victoria herself, and all 3 were providing various forms of consulting services to HOAs throughout the region. The money trail suggested that she was essentially creating a circular funding scheme where she paid her own companies to provide fake authority that justified her enforcement activities. It was an elegant system that created the appearance of legitimate outside oversight while actually consolidating all power in Victoria's hands. The level of planning and organization involved was impressive, but it also created exactly the kind of paper trail that could be used to prove criminal conspiracy charges. The most damning evidence came when I managed to access Victoria's office a second time and discovered what could only be described as her master plan for regional domination. The documents I found outlined something called the Property Acquisition Protocol, which included detailed maps of 12 rural properties in our area, complete with acquisition timelines and what she called pressure escalation methods. My ranch was prominently featured on these maps, marked as a high-priority target with notes about optimal timing for final acquisition attempts. The clinical language used to describe human beings as obstacles to be removed was chilling. But what really caught my attention was a handwritten note on the final page. If compliance fails, proceed to legal intimidation. If legal intimidation fails, proceed to physical enforcement. The implication was clear. Victoria had contingency plans that went far beyond fake legal documents and psychological pressure. The physical enforcement reference haunted me as I tried to understand what Victoria might be planning for property owners who refused to submit to her fake authority. The timeline in her documents suggested that several other rural landowners had already reached what she called final compliance deadlines, which meant I wasn't the only person facing whatever came after legal intimidation failed to achieve the desired results. The systematic nature of her operation meant that she'd probably faced resistance before and had developed protocols for dealing with property owners who couldn't be convinced to surrender their rights voluntarily. The question that kept me awake at night was whether physical enforcement meant actual violence or simply more sophisticated forms of intimidation that would make continued resistance seem impossible. Victoria's political connections added another layer of complexity to the situation that made traditional law enforcement responses potentially unreliable. The documents I'd found included correspondence with county officials who seemed either unaware of Victoria's illegal methods or deliberately choosing to ignore them in exchange for political support. Victoria had apparently been making strategic campaign contributions and offering what she called community development consulting to local politicians who might be in a position to legitimize her activities or protect her from legal consequences. The corruption wasn't necessarily extensive, but it was strategically placed in ways that could make it difficult to get proper law enforcement response to complaints about her activities. As I reviewed all the evidence I'd gathered, one thing became crystal clear. Victoria's progression from fake authority to fake legal documents was leading towards something that would make her previous crimes seem minor by comparison. Physical enforcement could mean anything from actual violence to more sophisticated forms of coercion that would be designed to break down the last remnants of resistance among her target properties. The question wasn't whether she would escalate further, but how much time I had before she crossed that line and how many other property owners would be caught in the crossfire when she did. The evidence I'd gathered was more than sufficient to expose her operation. But stopping Victoria would require more than just proof of her crimes. It would require a coordinated effort to protect her victims and ensure that justice was served before she could complete whatever final phase she was planning for our community. The scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise became fully clear when I spent the next week analyzing every document I'd copied from her computer. And what I discovered was far more ambitious and terrifying than simple property acquisition fraud. Victoria wasn't just targeting individual rural landowners to steal their property. She was systematically building what could only be described as a shadow government that would give her legitimate political power over an entire region. Her master plan involved creating a regional HOA authority that would control rural properties throughout the county through a combination of intimidation, forced annexation, and eventually legitimate legal backing from corrupted local officials. The documents laid out a 3-phase operation that was designed to transform her fake authority into real political power. with my ranch serving as a crucial test case for the psychological warfare tactics she planned to deploy on a much larger scale. The genius of Victoria's scheme was that she'd found a way to weaponize the very concept of HOAs against people who'd specifically chosen to live outside HOA jurisdiction. Phase 1 had involved identifying vulnerable rural properties and subjecting their owners to harassment campaigns designed to create the false impression that they were violating legitimate regulations. Phase 2, which I was currently experiencing, involved escalating that harassment to include fake legal documents and threats that were designed to break down resistance through psychological pressure and fear of financial ruin. But Phase 3 was where Victoria's true ambitions became clear. She was planning to use the voluntary compliance she'd extracted from terrorized property owners as evidence of community support for legitimizing her regional HOA authority through official government channels. The most disturbing aspect of her operation was how she'd systematically targeted rural landowners who were most likely to be isolated and vulnerable to her intimidation tactics. The property assessment documents I'd found weren't just evaluating land values. They were psychological profiles that identified owners who were elderly, financially stressed, or socially isolated in ways that would make them unlikely to mount effective resistance to her harassment campaigns. Victoria had apparently spent months identifying the perfect victims for her scheme, people who would be most likely to pay fake fees and submit to fake authority rather than risk legal battles they couldn't afford. The clinical precision with which she'd cataloged human vulnerabilities was as impressive as it was morally reprehensible. My investigation into Victoria's background revealed that she'd used virtually identical tactics in at least 2 other counties before moving to our area, which explained why her operation was so sophisticated and why she seemed to anticipate every possible form of resistance. In each previous location, she'd started with a small number of target properties, gradually expanded her fake authority through intimidation and forged documents, and eventually succeeded in getting local officials to legitimize her activities through what appeared to be community-supported initiatives. The pattern was always the same: create fake compliance, use that fake compliance as evidence of community support, and then leverage political connections to transform criminal fraud into legitimate authority. Victoria was essentially a political entrepreneur who specialized in manufacturing consent through systematic psychological warfare. The financial aspects of her operation were equally sophisticated and revealing. Through her 3 shell companies, Victoria had created a money laundering system that allowed her to funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake consulting contracts while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activities. Regional Authority Solutions had received over $300,000 from various HOAs that Victoria either controlled directly or influenced through her network of contacts. County Compliance Services was billing local government offices for enforcement consulting that was actually just Victoria providing fake expertise about regulations she'd created herself. Most audaciously, Property Standards Enforcement LLC was receiving payments from property owners who'd been terrorized into believing they owed compliance fees for violations that didn't exist under any legitimate legal authority. The scope of Victoria's political corruption was perhaps the most troubling aspect of her entire operation. She'd been making strategic campaign contributions to Commissioner Ellis and other local officials who were in positions to legitimize her activities or protect her from law enforcement scrutiny. In exchange for these contributions, Commissioner Ellis had been studying proposals to modernize rural property management, which was essentially a euphemism for giving HOAs expanded authority over properties outside their traditional jurisdiction. Victoria's correspondence with the commissioner showed that she was just 3 forced memberships away from meeting the threshold of community support that would allow Ellis to fast-track her regional HOA authority proposal without extensive public review or legal scrutiny. The victim I'd identified through social media, a rancher who had contacted me about similar harassment, agreed to meet with me and share his experience with Victoria's network. Tom had succumbed to the pressure 6 months earlier and joined Victoria's regional HOA after being subjected to the same escalating harassment campaign that I was currently experiencing. His story was a horrifying preview of what Victoria had planned for me and every other property owner who refused to submit voluntarily to her fake authority. After I paid the membership fee, Tom explained during our meeting at a diner far from both our properties. Victoria suddenly had legal basis to dictate everything about my property, what I could build, what animals I could keep, even what color I could paint my barn. She claimed that joining the regional HOA gave her enforcement authority that was backed by county regulations, but I never saw any of those regulations in writing. Tom's experience revealed the true endgame of Victoria's psychological warfare. She wasn't just trying to steal property or extract money through fake fees. She was building a legitimate business empire based on systematic extortion. Once property owners were terrorized into joining her regional HOA, she could impose whatever restrictions and fees she wanted while claiming legal authority that technically existed through the contracts her victims had been forced to sign. Victoria owned stakes in at least 3 construction companies that benefited from the compliance upgrades she required her fake members to purchase, creating a vertically integrated system where she profited from both the extortion and the services that victims were forced to buy to satisfy her manufactured requirements. The timeline Victoria had established for her operation showed that she was approaching a critical decision point that would determine whether her criminal enterprise succeeded in transforming into legitimate political authority. Commissioner Ellis had agreed to fast-track Victoria's regional HOA authority proposal if she could demonstrate sufficient community support through voluntary memberships and compliance statistics. According to the documents I'd found, Victoria needed just 3 more voluntary memberships to meet the threshold Ellis had established, and my ranch was specifically identified as the highest priority target for achieving that goal. The implication was clear. Victoria's harassment of me wasn't just about my specific property. It was about reaching the tipping point that would allow her to legitimize her entire criminal operation through official government approval. The most chilling revelation came when I discovered Victoria's contingency planning for property owners who continued to resist her authority even after being subjected to her full range of psychological pressure tactics. The documents included detailed protocols for what she called final acquisition procedures that were designed to make continued resistance economically impossible or physically dangerous. These protocols involved coordinated harassment campaigns that included fake legal proceedings, manufactured safety violations, and what were euphemistically described as community pressure initiatives that seemed designed to isolate resistant property owners from any possible sources of support or assistance. Victoria's network extended far beyond her immediate area of operations and included contacts with similar organizations in other counties who were apparently sharing tactics and resources for targeting rural property owners. The correspondence I had found suggested that Victoria's regional HOA authority was intended to serve as a model that could be replicated throughout the state, creating a network of fake governmental authorities that would give political cover to systematic property acquisition campaigns. The scope of her ambitions was breathtaking. She wasn't just trying to control rural properties in our county. She was building the foundation for a statewide system that could strip property rights from rural landowners while maintaining the appearance of legitimate democratic governance. As I reviewed all the evidence I'd gathered about Victoria's operation, the urgency of the situation became impossible to ignore. If Victoria succeeded in getting official approval for her regional HOA authority, every illegal tactic she'd used against me and other property owners would be retroactively legitimized through government sanction. The harassment, the fake documents, the psychological warfare, all of it would become officially sanctioned enforcement activity that would be virtually impossible to challenge through normal legal channels. Victoria was approaching the finish line of a marathon criminal enterprise that would transform her from a sophisticated fraud artist into a legitimate political authority with the power to destroy rural property rights throughout our region. The question wasn't whether I could gather enough evidence to expose her crimes, but whether I could stop her before she crossed that line and made her authority too legitimate to challenge. The evidence I'd gathered against Victoria was overwhelming, but I'd learned enough about her political connections to know that simply taking my findings to local law enforcement might not be sufficient to stop her operation. Victoria had been careful to cultivate relationships with exactly the people who would normally investigate complaints about her activities, and her systematic campaign contributions had created potential conflicts of interest that could delay or derail any official response. What I needed wasn't just evidence of her crimes, but a coordinated strategy that would expose her operation in ways that made political cover-up impossible and ensured that her victims received justice rather than continued harassment. The solution came when I realized that Victoria's greatest strength, her ability to isolate and intimidate individual property owners, was also her greatest vulnerability when those property owners worked together. My first step was organizing a secret meeting with the 8 harassed landowners I'd identified through my research, along with Margaret, the former board member who'd been fired for asking too many questions about Victoria's activities. We met at a community center in the next county over, far enough from Victoria's surveillance network that we could speak freely about our experiences and develop a coordinated response strategy. What emerged from that 3-hour meeting was the Rural Property Defense Alliance, a coalition with a legal fund and coordinated strategy designed to protect rural property owners from systematic harassment while ensuring that Victoria's criminal enterprise faced appropriate legal consequences. The relief on people's faces when they realized they weren't alone in fighting Victoria's fake authority was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Several attendees broke down in tears when they learned that their experiences weren't isolated incidents, but part of a criminal conspiracy. The attorney I hired specialized in HOA law and government corruption cases, and her analysis of the evidence we'd gathered confirmed that Victoria had been systematically violating multiple federal and state laws in ways that could result in serious prison time if properly prosecuted. The forged government documents alone constituted federal crimes that carried mandatory minimum sentences, while her systematic extortion of property owners qualified as racketeering under federal organized crime statutes. More importantly, my attorney confirmed that Victoria's operation had created exactly the kind of evidence trail that prosecutors love: detailed financial records, electronic communications, and physical evidence that would be virtually impossible for Victoria to explain away or dismiss as misunderstandings. The challenge wasn't proving Victoria's guilt, but ensuring that her prosecution happened quickly enough to prevent her from completing her plan to legitimize her authority through political channels. Our alliance documented every fake enforcement incident with timestamps, audio recordings, and photographic evidence that could be used to establish the systematic nature of Victoria's harassment campaigns. Margaret provided inside information about Victoria's board manipulation tactics and confirmed that Victoria had been making major financial decisions without proper board authorization, including the $50,000 payment to her own shell company that had never been approved by any legitimate board vote. The financial irregularities alone were sufficient to trigger investigations by state agencies responsible for overseeing nonprofit organizations, while the systematic harassment of property owners outside HOA jurisdiction violated multiple consumer protection laws that carried significant civil and criminal penalties. My research into Victoria's background revealed that she'd used virtually identical tactics in 2 other counties before moving to our area, which meant that her current operation was part of a pattern of criminal behavior that could be prosecuted under federal racketeering statutes. The evidence from those previous operations included victim testimonials, financial records, and documentation of the same shell company structures that Victoria was currently using to launder money through fake consulting contracts. More importantly, several victims from those previous operations were willing to testify about Victoria's methods, creating a comprehensive picture of her criminal enterprise that would be impossible for any prosecutor to ignore. The pattern evidence also revealed Victoria's weakness. Her arrogance had led her to keep detailed records of her criminal activities because she'd been confident that her political connections would protect her from serious legal consequences. The breakthrough in our investigation came when Margaret revealed that Victoria's current board included a member who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of Victoria's activities but had been too intimidated to speak out publicly. The board member, an accountant who joined the HOA to help with legitimate financial oversight, had been keeping her own records of Victoria's suspicious activities and was willing to wear a wire to the next board meeting in exchange for protection from retaliation. The recording we obtained from that meeting was a prosecutor's dream. Victoria explicitly instructing her enforcement team to use all tactics, including fake citations, surveillance, and whatever else might be necessary to force my compliance before the Commissioner Ellis meeting that would determine whether her regional HOA authority received official approval. Victoria's final offer to me came in the form of a registered letter that was designed to create a paper trail showing that she'd given me every opportunity to comply voluntarily before escalating to more aggressive tactics. Join the regional HOA voluntarily with a $5,000 membership fee, the letter stated, or face escalated enforcement actions that will make your previous experiences seem pleasant by comparison. The threat was both explicit and carefully worded to avoid specific claims that could be easily prosecuted, but the implication was clear. Victoria was prepared to do whatever was necessary to force my compliance before her critical meeting with Commissioner Ellis. The timing of her ultimatum confirmed what I had suspected about her timeline. She was operating under political pressure to demonstrate community support for her proposal, and my continued resistance was threatening her ability to meet the thresholds that Commissioner Ellis had established. Our alliance's strategy for exposing Victoria required perfect timing and coordination between multiple agencies to ensure that her political connections couldn't be used to delay or derail the investigation. We planned to present our evidence simultaneously to the State Attorney General's office, the FBI's white-collar crime unit, and local media outlets that specialized in investigative reporting about government corruption. The goal was to create so much public pressure and legal scrutiny that Victoria's political allies would be forced to distance themselves from her activities rather than risk their own careers by providing protection for an obvious criminal enterprise. We also coordinated with real law enforcement agencies to ensure that Victoria's fake enforcement officers could be arrested for impersonating government officials if they attempted any further harassment of alliance members. The wire recording that captured Victoria's instructions to her board was the smoking gun that transformed our case from a collection of individual complaints into evidence of a systematic criminal conspiracy. Harlan is our final target before commissioner approval, Victoria's voice clearly stated on the recording. Use all tactics, fake citations, surveillance, whatever it takes. Once we get official status, everything we've done becomes retroactively legal. The recording not only proved Victoria's criminal intent, but also revealed her understanding that her current activities were illegal and would remain so unless she could successfully manipulate the political process to her advantage. The casual way she discussed systematic lawbreaking while planning to use political corruption to avoid consequences demonstrated exactly the kind of arrogance that had led her to create such detailed evidence of her own criminal activities. Victoria's escalation schedule indicated that she was planning to present her rural HOA success story to Commissioner Ellis within 1 week of sending me her final ultimatum, which meant that our alliance had very little time to coordinate the multi-agency response that would be necessary to stop her operation before it received official government sanction. The timeline pressure was exactly what Victoria had intended. She was forcing a crisis that would require immediate decisions from everyone involved, betting that her victims would choose compliance over the uncertainty of legal battles they might not be able to win. But Victoria had made a critical miscalculation in her assessment of my willingness to fight back. She had assumed that military training would make me more likely to respect authority, when in reality it had taught me exactly how to recognize and respond to systematic intimidation tactics. The evidence we'd gathered was more than sufficient to destroy Victoria's operation and send her to prison for a very long time. But stopping her would require more than just proving her crimes. It would require a coordinated public exposure that made her political protection impossible and ensured that justice was served before she could complete her transformation from criminal fraud artist to legitimate political authority. The Commissioner Ellis meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, and Victoria arrived early with the kind of confident swagger that comes from believing you've already won the war. She had prepared an elaborate presentation complete with professionally designed slides, carefully crafted testimonials from her coerced members, and fabricated statistics about improved rural property values under her regional HOA authority system. The conference room was packed with local officials, media representatives, and what Victoria believed were supportive community members who would witness her transformation from criminal fraud artist to legitimate political authority. What she didn't realize was that more than half the people in that room were there specifically to watch her downfall, armed with evidence that would destroy not just her immediate plans, but her entire criminal enterprise. Victoria's presentation was a masterclass in political manipulation that would have been impressive if it hadn't been built on systematic criminal fraud. For 15 minutes, she spoke eloquently about voluntary membership growth that was actually the result of systematic intimidation, compliance success rates that were measured by how effectively she'd terrorized property owners into submission, and community satisfaction statistics that were entirely fabricated. She referenced her fake county ordinances and made up state regulations with the kind of confident authority that had convinced so many of her victims that resistance was futile. Her performance was polished enough to convince anyone who hadn't seen the evidence of her crimes. But every word she spoke was being recorded by multiple devices and would shortly be used as evidence in her prosecution for systematic fraud and corruption. I sat in the audience with our alliance members and our attorney, watching Victoria dig herself deeper into criminal liability with every confident assertion she made about her legitimate authority. The camera crews from 3 local news stations were present for what they'd been told was a routine government meeting about rural property management. But they were about to witness the kind of spectacular public collapse that makes for front-page news and viral social media content. Victoria had no idea that the very evidence she was presenting as proof of her success was actually documented proof of her systematic violation of multiple federal and state laws. Her arrogance was about to become the instrument of her own destruction, and the irony was beautiful enough to almost make up for the months of harassment she'd put me and other property owners through. When the public comment period began, I stood up and addressed Victoria with the kind of respectful tone that would make my subsequent revelations even more devastating. "Ms. Langford," I said, projecting my voice clearly enough that everyone in the room could hear every word. "I have some questions about your enforcement authority and the legal basis for your regional HOA activities." I produced the audio recordings of her fake enforcement officers claiming they represented county authority, playing them through a portable speaker that filled the conference room with the sound of Victoria's employees explicitly impersonating government officials. The recordings were followed by photographs of the forged documents Victoria had used to intimidate property owners, each image clearly showing fake county seals and non-existent legal authorities that she'd manufactured to support her harassment campaigns. Victoria's response to my evidence was exactly what I'd hoped for. Instead of backing down or attempting damage control, she doubled down on her claims with the kind of arrogant defiance that would make her subsequent humiliation even more complete. "Mr. Harlan has been consistently uncooperative with legitimate regional compliance standards," she declared, her voice taking on the imperious tone she'd used to terrorize so many rural property owners. "Our enforcement methods are fully justified to protect community interests and property values throughout the region." Her refusal to acknowledge the evidence against her was playing directly into our strategy because every word of her defense was being recorded and would be used to prove her criminal intent when she was eventually prosecuted for her systematic fraud. The smoking gun moment came when I played the wire recording that our alliance had obtained from Victoria's own board meeting, filling the conference room with the sound of her voice explicitly instructing her team to use all tactics, including fake citations, surveillance, and whatever else might be necessary to force compliance from resistant property owners. Victoria's own words, captured in high-quality digital audio, provided undeniable proof that she was knowingly directing systematic criminal activities while planning to legitimize those activities through political corruption. The recording also included her admission that once we get official status, everything we've done becomes retroactively legal, which demonstrated her understanding that her current activities were illegal and would remain so unless she could manipulate the political process to her advantage. Commissioner Ellis's reaction to the evidence was immediate and decisive as his political survival instincts kicked in, and he realized that continued association with Victoria would destroy his own career. "Ms. Langford," he said, his voice carrying the kind of official authority that Victoria had been counterfeiting for months. "Are you saying that you've been issuing false government documents and impersonating county officials?" Victoria's response was pure panic disguised as indignation as she tried to claim that the recordings were taken out of context and that her activities were perfectly legal under the new state regulations. But her explanations only made her situation worse because every attempt to justify her actions provided additional evidence of her criminal intent and her knowledge that she was systematically violating federal and state laws. The law enforcement response had been coordinated in advance with our attorney, and sheriff's deputies entered the conference room with arrest warrants that had been prepared based on the evidence our alliance had gathered over the previous weeks. The deputies announced charges of impersonating government officials, wire fraud, extortion, and operating a criminal enterprise. Federal crimes that carried mandatory minimum sentences and would ensure that Victoria's political connections couldn't be used to negotiate sweetheart plea deals. The contrast between the real law enforcement officers with their legitimate authority and Victoria's fake enforcement team was stark and humiliating, demonstrating to everyone present exactly what actual legal authority looked like compared to Victoria's manufactured substitute. The payoff for all the foreshadowing and evidence gathering from the previous months was spectacular and complete. Every fake document from our first confrontation was now evidence of systematic forgery that would be used in Victoria's prosecution. The sedan surveillance that had made me feel like a hunted animal was revealed to be part of Victoria's systematic intelligence gathering operation that had been used to target multiple rural property owners. Regional Authority Solutions, the shell company that had seemed so mysteriously connected to Victoria's activities, was exposed as her personal money laundering operation that had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake consulting contracts. All the harassed landowners who had felt isolated and powerless were now witnesses in a federal criminal case that would ensure Victoria faced serious consequences for her systematic destruction of rural property rights. Victoria's final downfall was as complete and humiliating as her victims could have hoped for, and it happened in front of the largest audience she'd ever tried to manipulate. As she was being arrested in front of the packed conference room with news cameras rolling, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to justify her actions by appealing to the same authoritarian impulses that had driven her criminal enterprise from the beginning. "You people don't understand," she shouted as the handcuffs were being applied. "I was creating order and accountability. These rural properties need proper oversight and regulation." Her words revealed the core mentality that had motivated her systematic harassment of property owners, a genuine belief that she had the right to impose her will on other people's lives and property regardless of their consent or any legitimate legal authority. The live television coverage of Victoria's arrest and perp walk from the county building was the kind of spectacular public humiliation that ensures criminal activities receive appropriate social consequences in addition to legal punishment. The news anchor's report was succinct and devastating. Local HOA president arrested for running elaborate fake authority scam targeting rural landowners throughout the region. The coverage included footage of Victoria's failed presentation, audio from her own incriminating wire recordings, and interviews with her victims, who were finally able to speak publicly about the systematic harassment they'd endured. Commissioner Ellis immediately suspended all consideration of Victoria's regional HOA authority proposal and announced a comprehensive investigation into her political contributions and any other officials who might have been compromised by her corruption. The immediate aftermath of Victoria's arrest created a domino effect that exposed the broader network of corruption she'd been building throughout the region. Several other HOA officials who'd been implementing similar tactics in neighboring communities suddenly found themselves under investigation as law enforcement agencies realized that Victoria's operation was part of a larger pattern of systematic fraud targeting rural property owners. The shell companies she'd created to launder money and create fake authority were frozen by federal investigators, and the financial records they contained provided evidence of a criminal enterprise that had been systematically stealing from rural communities for years. Victoria's political allies immediately began distancing themselves from her activities, claiming they'd been unaware of her illegal methods and had been deceived by her professional presentations and manufactured evidence of community support. The scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise became fully apparent as investigators worked through the evidence our alliance had provided and discovered additional victims who'd been too intimidated or isolated to report their harassment. Victoria had systematically targeted rural property owners throughout a three-county area, using identical tactics to terrorize people into submission while building a criminal empire that would have eventually given her legitimate political power over thousands of rural properties. Her arrest not only saved my ranch and the properties of other alliance members, but prevented her from completing a transformation that would have made her fake authority too legitimate to challenge through normal legal processes. The legal resolution of Victoria's case was swift and comprehensive in ways that exceeded even our most optimistic expectations for justice. Victoria Langford was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud, impersonating government officials, and running a criminal enterprise under federal racketeering statutes. The judge's sentencing statement made it clear that Victoria's systematic targeting of vulnerable rural property owners represented exactly the kind of predatory behavior that federal organized crime laws were designed to punish, and the mandatory minimum sentences ensured that her political connections couldn't be used to negotiate reduced penalties. HOA Prairie Ridge was dissolved by court order, with its remaining assets distributed to harassed landowners as partial compensation for the psychological trauma and financial losses they'd suffered during Victoria's reign of manufactured terror. Commissioner Ellis, whose political career had been irreparably damaged by his association with Victoria's criminal enterprise, faced an ethics investigation that revealed the full extent of his corruption and ultimately forced his resignation from public office. The investigation uncovered not just Victoria's direct campaign contributions, but a broader pattern of quid pro quo arrangements where Ellis had agreed to fast-track proposals in exchange for political support and consulting fees from Victoria's shell companies. The ethics investigation also revealed that Ellis had been aware of complaints about Victoria's activities but had chosen to ignore them because her political support was valuable for his own career advancement. His downfall served as a powerful reminder that public officials who enable systematic fraud will eventually face consequences for their corruption. My personal vindication was complete and satisfying in ways that went far beyond simple legal victory. The ranch property values that Victoria had claimed to be protecting through her fake enforcement activities proved to be completely stable without her systematic harassment, demonstrating that her entire justification for the regional HOA authority had been manufactured to serve her criminal ambitions rather than any legitimate community interest. I received the Citizen Service Award from the State Attorney General's office for my role in exposing Victoria's criminal enterprise, and the citation specifically praised my courage in standing up to systematic intimidation and my dedication to protecting the rights of rural property owners throughout the region. More importantly, my story became a training case study for law enforcement agencies throughout the state, helping them recognize and respond to similar HOA corruption schemes that might be operating in their own jurisdictions. The other victims of Victoria's systematic harassment received the justice they deserved through both criminal prosecutions and civil remedies that addressed the full scope of damage they'd suffered. Tom and the other property owners who'd been terrorized into joining Victoria's fake regional HOA had their coerced contracts declared legally void, with all fees and fines refunded plus interest that reflected the criminal nature of Victoria's extortion scheme. A psychological counseling fund was established for harassment victims who needed professional help recovering from the systematic intimidation they'd endured. Recognizing that Victoria's crimes had inflicted genuine trauma that required more than just financial compensation to address properly, several victims who had sold their properties under pressure from Victoria's harassment campaigns were given the option to buy back their land at the prices they'd received, plus compensation for any improvements that had been made during their forced absence. The systemic reforms triggered by Victoria's prosecution went far beyond our local situation and created statewide changes that would protect rural property owners from similar criminal enterprises in the future. The state legislature passed the Rural Property Protection Act, which strictly limited HOA expansion authority and created clear legal penalties for any association that attempted to exercise jurisdiction over properties outside their legitimate boundaries. A new oversight board was established to investigate complaints about HOA activities and ensure that legitimate associations operated within proper legal constraints, while criminal HOA activities would be referred directly to federal authorities for prosecution under organized crime statutes. Most importantly, new transparency requirements were imposed on HOA financial dealings and enforcement actions, making it virtually impossible for future operators to create the kind of shell company money laundering systems that Victoria had used to fund her criminal enterprise. The closing motif of my story brought everything full circle in ways that highlighted how completely Victoria's reign of terror had been ended. I was working on ranch improvements again, just as I had been on that first morning when her fake enforcement officers had stormed onto my property with their manufactured authority and fraudulent legal documents. But this time, when a county inspector stopped by for a routine permit check, the interaction demonstrated exactly what legitimate government authority looked like compared to Victoria's criminal substitute. The inspector carried proper credentials, followed established procedures, treated me with professional respect, and conducted his inspection according to clearly defined legal standards that I could verify through official government sources. The contrast with Victoria's systematic harassment couldn't have been more stark, and the peaceful resolution of legitimate regulatory compliance felt like a celebration of everything that Victoria's fake authority had tried to destroy. My evolution from victim to advocate was perhaps the most personally satisfying aspect of Victoria's downfall, as I transformed the military training she tried to use against me into a resource for protecting other rural property owners from similar criminal enterprises. I established the Rural Rights Resource Center, a website that helped landowners verify legitimate authority and report suspicious HOA activities to appropriate law enforcement agencies. The Resource Center provided templates for documenting harassment, guides for recognizing fake legal documents, and direct connections to federal investigators who specialized in HOA fraud cases. More importantly, the center created a network of rural property owners who could support each other against systematic intimidation and ensure that no one would have to face criminal harassment in isolation. The State Attorney General's office offered me a consultant position on the HOA Fraud Prevention Task Force, recognizing that my firsthand experience with Victoria's criminal methods made me uniquely qualified to help law enforcement agencies recognize and respond to similar schemes in other communities. I accepted the part-time role while maintaining my ranch operations, finding deep satisfaction in using my experience as Victoria's target to help protect other rural property owners from systematic harassment and fraud. The consulting work involved training law enforcement officers to recognize the patterns of fake authority schemes, helping prosecutors understand the psychological warfare tactics used to terrorize victims into compliance, and working with legislators to develop stronger legal protections for rural property rights. The federal investigation revealed that Victoria's operation had been part of a broader pattern of criminal activity that targeted rural communities throughout the country, suggesting that her arrest had disrupted just one node of a much larger criminal network that was systematically destroying rural property rights through psychological warfare and political corruption. As I looked out at my peaceful ranch and then at my laptop screen showing emails from desperate landowners throughout the country who were facing systematic harassment similar to what I had experienced, the choice to continue the fight was obvious. The closing message of my story wasn't about the satisfaction of defeating one particular criminal, but about the ongoing vigilance required to protect rural property rights from systematic fraud and political corruption. In a democracy, eternal vigilance truly is the price of freedom, especially the freedom to live peacefully on your own land without being subjected to fake authority and manufactured legal compliance requirements. Victoria's prosecution had proven that criminal enterprises targeting rural property owners could be defeated through coordinated resistance and proper legal channels. But it had also revealed the sophistication of the threats facing rural communities and the importance of staying alert for new variations on her criminal methods. The fight for rural property rights continues in communities throughout the country. And the example of Victoria's downfall serves as both inspiration for resistance and warning about the ongoing threats that rural property owners face from systematic fraud and political corruption. What do you think about the injustice and veiled threats of violence in stories like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Take a stand on how we can combat such abuses in everyday life and express your views.